In today's biased news, Russia scraps the grain deal, an Italian workers' strike grounds air travel, and peace talks for the Sudan conflict resume in Saudi Arabia. After 4 months of war, talks have resumed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces currently fighting across Khartoum and other major urban centers in Sudan. Parallel efforts are being made by Egypt, following multiple ceasefire violations over the past several months. Since April 15th, a struggle for power has taken place between General Burhan of the Sudanese army and the RSF commander Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. The two sides are represented by differing interests within Sudan, namely institutional state-backed capital for the Sudanese army, which runs counter to the RSF desire for independence from state control. The conflict has resulted in over 3,000 deaths, and displaced over 3 million people. Several rounds of peace talks have failed, most recently after the Sudanese army boycotted talks in Ethiopia last week after accusing the Kenyan president of RSF bias. In the background, urban warfare and looting have disrupted services such as healthcare and banking, and 1.5 million people have since been forced to flee the capital. Mass reports of the targeting of civilians have been made by both sides, though it's difficult to confirm these claims in the midst of the turmoil. The UN commented, "We cannot replenish stores of food, water, and medicine if brazen looting of these stocks continues. We cannot deliver if our staff are prevented from reaching people in need." Instability has tormented the region for decades as a result of colonially determined borders, as well as systematic attempts by the US, the IMF, and the World Bank to keep these nations overexploited and forcibly underdeveloped. The fact that this manufactured instability has exploded into civil war after the breakdown of fragile institutions manipulated by these international powers should not come as a surprise. Conflicts like these will continue to occur as long as the imperialist nations of the world are allowed to rob the periphery. The South Korean president has made a surprise visit to Ukraine, casting their lot with the embattled country in its conflict with Russia. Yoon pledged to expand South Korea's non-lethal military aid to Ukraine and increase humanitarian aid. The two leaders discussed cooperation on post-war reconstruction efforts, joining the ranks of the Western powers and notorious war profiteers like BlackRock. After all, there's plenty of profit to be made in rebuilding a country you helped destroy. Russia has announced the suspension of its participation in a UN-brokered deal that allowed Ukrainian grain to be exported through the Black Sea. The decision came hours after Russia claimed that Ukraine had attacked the Crimean Bridge, resulting in 2 deaths. The Kremlin stated that the suspension of the grain deal was unrelated to the bridge attack, but instead due to the agreement's lack of implementation. The Chicago Board of Trade's wheat contract rose by 3.4% following the announcement. The Black Sea deal was aimed at addressing a global food crisis worsened by the Russo-Ukrainian War. The consequences could be dire: higher food prices, starvation in the developing world, and higher economic instability. In gaming news, and the classic capitalism leads to monopoly rule, Microsoft and Sony shook hands on continuing to release Call of Duty for PlayStation. Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, the maker of the best-selling Call of Duty games, has raised concerns that it could lead to anti-competitive behavior. The $68.7 billion acquisition deal would be the biggest of its kind in gaming industry history. Sony had previously worried that Microsoft would make Call of Duty and other Activision games exclusive to Xbox. Sunday's binding agreement means that Call of Duty will continue to be released on both the Xbox and the PlayStation. U.S. climate envoy John Kerry has arrived in Beijing for discussions on climate issues with China. Experts do not anticipate concrete progress from the talks, and believe it's unlikely for the two countries to return to where they were in 2021. Disagreements between China and the US on how to address climate change, for example, China actually doing things and the US just talking about it, pose challenges to cooperation. Pessimism and bitterness surround Kerry's visit, with concerns over the US's condescending approach and punitive measures against China's green industry. The recent high-level visits between China and the US are viewed as positive signals overall, but it remains to be seen whether we can avoid real conflict between the two nations. And in positive news for the day, Italian airport ground crew strikers showed how it's done when their 8-hour strike led to the cancellation of around 1,000 domestic and international flights. While it is unfortunate that over 250,000 passengers were left waiting around, it was a striking show of the importance and impact of labor, without which nothing moves. Ryanair pilots at a Belgian airport also went on strike, resulting in the cancellation of 120 flights. The strike occurred during peak tourism season and amid a heat wave in Italy. The striking workers included pilots, flight attendants, baggage handlers, and airport personnel. With strikes and union activity on the rise around the world, there's room for hope that labor still has some fight left in it. That's all for today. We'll be back day after tomorrow with more news. If you missed them, be sure to check out our previous episodes by following the links on your screen. As always, you can support the show and get the news in text form a few hours early by becoming a patron at patreon.com/firstthought.